Welcome to the walkthrough for assignment 2B's Frequently Made Mistakes. This is for the CS 254 class at Vanderbilt University. First and foremost, please make sure you document your code thoroughly. It's not sufficient just to provide the implementation and rely on my specification comments, but you actually have to document your code so I can understand what you think that you're trying to do. So let's take a look at some of the problems. Here's the first set of problems from the Simple Semaphore class. This implementation does not meet the specification. You need to implement your own Simple Semaphore using a count that doesn't use the existing Java semaphore, which completely misses the point of this assignment. Because of course the Java semaphore does a lot of stuff under the hood that you need to be doing using a reentrant lock and a condition object. Down here we see another problem from the field portion of Simple Semaphore. This implementation doesn't meet the specification comment that was above, which requires this field ensure its values aren't cached by multiple threads. So you need to make sure you put the type qualifier there to make sure that it's not cached and it instead goes directly to memory. Reads and writes go directly to memory. Let's take a look now at some of the problems with the constructor of Simple Semaphore. Again, don't implement Simple Semaphore using a Java semaphore. That totally misses the point. And down here, I'm not sure what this is trying to do, but take a look at the examples we used in class for using Java condition object, and most specifically how you create a Java condition object. And I think you'll quickly realize that this is not the way to create a Java condition object. We never showed anything like this in class. This is very complicated and convoluted, and nothing would ever work effectively if that was the way things were done. So go back and watch the videos and make sure you understand how to create a condition object. Here's another problem along those same lines. There's something very important that's missing here. In particular, the condition object is not being initialized at all. So that needs to be fixed too. And once again, go back and take a look at the videos from the course, especially the ones having to do with the condition object implementation of the array blocking queue class. And you'll see how these things get initialized. So let's now move our attention to problems with acquire. So first thing, you don't need to use a catch here with a try catch. That's unnecessary. You shouldn't be relying on catch to do the unlock. That should always be done using finally. And down here, this code needs to be restructured to use a try finally block that ensures that if await throws an exception, my lock will always be unlocked. So this code has just a bunch of things that need to be refactored. And again, I recommend you go back and take a look at the videos that walk through the proper use of condition object. A good place to start again is the array blocking queue example we walked through in class. Let's now come down here and take a look at another problem with acquire. The choice of method you're calling here doesn't fulfill the specification. The lock method is not interruptible, so you need to use the version of lock that is interruptible. And also, please make sure that you always check the condition in a loop, not with an if statement, but you need to use a loop. And that's discussed again in detail in the class slides on condition objects. So please go back and watch that. You should not be calling available permits here again, because that should be folded into the loop condition up here. And please get in the habit of using something like current permits, cur permits minus instead of using cur permits minus equal 1. And again, you don't need to catch an exception. You don't need to be catching the interrupted exception only to turn around and instantly throw it again. Just let it percolate up the call stack and it'll get handled in the appropriate way further up the stack. Let's now turn our attention to some problems with acquire uninterruptibly. This code here doesn't fulfill the specification comment, which means you need to keep looping until you're able to acquire the semaphore, and then you need to make sure you set the interrupt call properly. This is not doing it properly. This code should be refactored so that it calls acquire rather than duplicating any of acquire's logic. Again here, when an interrupt occurs, you should set a Boolean flag. You should not call unlock here. You should only ever call unlock in acquire. You don't want to be calling it in acquire uninterruptibly. And then down here, you shouldn't be checking to see if thread interrupted is true. You should be checking the Boolean flag that you set if a interrupted exception is caught, and then interrupting the calling thread if that's the case. So lots of problems with this implementation of acquire uninterruptibly. Now let's turn our attention to some problems with release. This code has a race condition, a bad race condition since the lock is never locked, and you should also only increment your permit count before checking whether permits is greater than 0. So this needs to be modified so that you first do that increment and then you do the check. Another thing that's important here, only call signal if the permits are greater than 1. If permits are less than or equal to 1, you don't want to call signal. You might ask, how could the permit count be less than 0 or 0? And that can occur if someone sets the semaphore's permit count initially to a negative number in the constructor, which is a little weird, but it's perfectly acceptable in the context of Java, as we talked about in the discussion about Java Semaphore, for example. And so you can have those things be set to negative numbers in semaphores. In release, please don't use a while loop here. You just need to use an if statement, and then you can signal appropriately. So now let's start turning our attention to the Palantiri manager part of the code. And this is going to be a discussion of build model. So build model is missing something very important here. You're not passing something in to the constructor of Simple Semaphore properly. And down here, the Palantiri map was initialized, but it was not, or rather it was created, but we didn't initialize it to anything. So that's going to be problematic later when you get into acquire and release. Down here in acquire, you don't really need to have a try catch block here. You don't need catch at all. Just let the interrupted exception percolate up the call stack. So get rid of the try catch. And then down here, you don't need to use get value. Instead, what you should be doing is using set value. And then if you do that properly and you replace get value with set value, you can get rid of peak altogether. And you'll have to do some other fancy footwork to make this work properly, but that'll get you a little more cleaner along. And also don't use or else throw, use something like or else null instead. Let's take a look down here. This example has a big bug. It's acquiring the lock, which is correct. And then it's going right into checking to see whether there's any available Palantiri, but we haven't called something really important, which is the whole reason why we have a simple semaphore, hint, hint. So make sure you think about that carefully. Here's another issue with acquire. A lot of people had this problem. Don't return a Palantiri and then use replace down here below, but instead either return a map entry or revise this code to not require the use of replace at all. Whatever you do, don't use replace. Don't use replace because it's inefficient. So you either need to return a map entry and then do something with that, or you need to modify the stream up here to avoid the need to use replace. And I'll let you kind of puzzle that out, but do not use replace. It's inefficient, requires another hash lookup. Here's another problem with acquire. Don't filter on get value and then go ahead and do a complicated map operation. Instead, filter on a lambda expression using set value. And when that works, when you get something that actually gets through there correctly, then use map to go ahead and return the key from that map entry. And now let's take a look at some problems with the release method in the Palantiri manager. So I'm not quite sure why we're checking to see if Palantiri is null twice. That's kind of a belt and suspenders approach. That's overkill. You don't need to do that. Just check it once. But make sure you check it. So this code has the opposite problem. It doesn't check if Palantiri is null at all before doing other things. And this code has all kinds of problems. So first of all, never lock the lock in the try portion of a try finally block, but instead always move it to before the try block, as we talked about in the videos and in class. Also, you need to get the return value from put or release if you, replace, put or replace if you used replace instead of put. And then use the return value to determine whether or not to call release, and also whether or not to throw the illegal argument exception. So you need to make sure you get that stuff right. And only call release when replace or when put return the appropriate value. And also always make sure to always call unlock in the finally block. So you need to make sure that you always call unlock in the finally block. Very important. Don't call lock in the try block, but always call unlock in the finally block. And then we come down here. There's some more problems here. You don't need to have this catch clause here. That's unnecessary. And down here, you don't need this try catch clause either. Just use a way to conditionally call release. And make sure you only call release on the semaphore if is replaced is equal to boolean.false. So those were the primary mistakes that I saw when I reviewed all the submissions for assignment 2B. Please make sure you address those. Please make sure your unit tests pass. And if you have any questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to post them to Piazza.